Okay, so we're managing weeds in production nurseries. It is a quite packed webinar, and so here's a brief overview. We're going to touch on the larger project under which this webinar sits. We'll talk about weed life cycles, identification, cultural management practices to reduce weeds passively, hand weeding, physical removal, and herbicides. A lot to get through. We're going to go straight into it. So a brief summary of this project. This is actually the third project that the Department of Agriculture in Queensland has had. It's similar. We're supporting the production nursery industry. So, and each project has been a little bit different. So this project has started this year from 2021, and it goes until 2025. In this project, all production nurseries receive 6 free diagnostic samples through the service Grow Help Australia. So what that means is if you have a sick plant, if you're a production nursery, a commercial production nursery, you have a sick plant or multiple sick plants, you can send samples to us and we will diagnose them, run tests, work out what's wrong with them, what's not wrong with them, and send you a report with some recommendations. As part of the project, we are also updating, creating new fact sheets, management plans, resources. These will be made available to you or highlighted through the GIA newsletter, and they're mostly present on the Nursery Production FMS website. That's a great website. Can you people just raise your hand if you've seen this website, if you use this website and to download information? Got a couple hands that have gone up. I'm going to now stop the hands from being up. Great. To me, there was only 1 or 2 hands that went up. Awesome that you're doing that. It is an awesome website. It has so much information on all aspects of production nursery management, weeds, media, pests and diseases rather, your cultural management associated with managing your media, your water, water disinfestation, you name it, it's there. Some with more detail some with areas with more detail than others. So it's a great resource, use it. Now the last thing I'll touch on for this project, there's quite a large section running experiments looking at the effect of nursery hygiene, nursery practice on the incidence of pests and diseases. Okay. So now into the webinar itself, weed life cycles and identification. I just noticed there's a hand up. So if just write, if the hand's up, write your question, or we'll touch base from time to time. All right. So what's a weed? Most of the time, the most common weed definition I hear is a weed is just a plant out of place. However, it's a little bit different from production nursery perspective in that sometimes the plants you're selling in other situations can be a little bit weedy, and you can spot the one that or one of the ones that I'm referring to here. So in that sense, for a production nursery, it really is any plant that's in your container that you are selling that you're not intending to sell. If it's not on the label and it's growing in the pot, it's a weed. And generally that's bad. So there are lots of different definitions of different types of weeds, and we're going to go through a couple of these because it can help when it comes to understanding the way weeds are described, weed biology is described, as well as for different product labels. So you've got your winter, summer, annual weeds, and these are weeds that generally complete their life cycle in winter or in summer. And oftentimes there are multiple generations in that season. However, depending on where you are located, the biology of the weed, you may well end up having a continuous production or continuous management of those weeds at your nursery. And that's part of the reason why this webinar is relatively general. We can't talk about the weeds that are going to be managed in one area because really Australia is diverse. The weeds that one nursery deals with are going to be different from another. Then you've got perennial weeds. These are weeds that live for a relatively long period of time, multiple years. They typically spread seed during spring and summer. Obviously, again, dependent on your area, that's going to change. They may also be capable of spreading via vegetative reproduction, bulbs, root fragmentation, so on and so forth. So it's important to understand the basic ways in which these weeds grow so that you can manage them to the best of your ability. We also have grasses and sedges, and often these two groups can appear similar until you have some basics on how to identify them. So in general, your grasses, they've got those hollow, rounded stems, as indicated here, whereas your sedges, which aren't grasses, but sometimes are grouped together on some herbicide labels, they're solid and triangular. They both have parallel veins. They can appear superficially similar, so your nutgrass versus just a normal Poaceae grass. Okay, and then you've got everything else, your broadleaf weeds. They're incredibly diverse, and again, some are widespread, others are very localized. Then we have other types of plants. We've got mosses, algae, and liverwoods. They're plants, but simple plants. They're not your typical plant. They don't have true roots, stems, and leaves, but they have organs that approximate those same functions. And they're particularly problematic on surfaces containers. Who deals with liverwoods in particular? Just raise your hand if you are regularly battling liverwoods. Got a couple hands raised. That's great. Presumably, not always a southern state issue, but most commonly. This picture actually did come from a nursery that was in Queensland. I was surprised. But anyway, they are problematic on the surface of the containers and on the ground, particularly where there's high moisture, there's the right amount of light, good temperature, generally cooler, just because they require that moisture content, and high nutrients. And these components do end up giving you some clues as to how they are best managed. And then you have aquatic weeds and algae, which we are only touching on briefly, but there is more information available on the FMS website, specifically on the management of your water, dams and tanks to reduce algal problems. Okay, so how do plants spread? This is important because as we know how they spread, and most of the people understand how they spread, but we'll just list them off quickly. Most of the weeds in production nurseries, they are going to be spread via seed. Yes, they'll grow within a pot, but to get from one pot to the next, they'll be spreading in one way or another. And this can be via wind, by explosive dehiscence, so some weeds actually effectively explode and send their seed a meter away, up to 3, sometimes closer to 4 meters away. Via birds, water, particularly algae, can be spread through irrigation systems and whatnot. And there's actually not very much information, not much research worldwide on water disinfestation techniques that are effective against algae. Yes, some systems may be effective, but the data isn't out there. So that is unfortunately an area which needs more work, and hopefully that will be solved over time. And then movement of containers. We move containers around our nursery, perhaps onto a throw-out pile, perhaps just moving from one section to another. If there are weeds present and there are seeds present, then potentially you are moving it around and causing further problems that are not necessarily they could be prevented, let's put it that way. Contaminated growing media and vehicles equipment. And we're going to talk about how these things can be managed, best practice, in the next section. Okay, so how do we identify weeds? Because weed populations change over time. So why do we identify them? Well, basically it's so that we can get some information on their biology, understand the length of time taken to produce a seed, for that seed to germinate. Sometimes you have specific management techniques that once you know what it is, you can put in place techniques to get rid of them most effectively, and as well have an idea of the types of herbicides that are susceptible to the herbicides that are effective against managing those weeds, because not all weeds are controlled in the same way, and you've got to change your practices depending on the subset of weeds that you have. And in that sense, the weeds that are most abundant at your nursery can be considered to be the ones that are being managed least effectively. So when you can have that sort of mindset, all of a sudden you go, oh, all right, well, how do I change my management techniques so that these weeds are less abundant? Okay, so how do we identify our weeds so that you can get that information? There's a lot of literature online. There are local government weed awareness websites. There are plant identification apps, and I'm curious to know, does anybody use an app, either on their phone or some other place? Raise your hand. Okay, yes. And if you wouldn't, there's at least one, two. If you have some great experiences and would like to share those, please do so, and we will we'll update the group, or update the group soon. So you can submit pictures of plants to your local state herbarium or actual specimens, and they will identify those weeds. That is a great way of confirming the identification. You may have knowledgeable staff, and sometimes you may have clients saying, hey, we got this plant, your plants, they're full of weed X, Y, Z. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but it may well happen from time to time. And the idea with this is that we can reduce that. Now, in terms of identifying weeds, our recommendations are to assess the weed diversity at least once per season in a devoted way. So you'll walk around your nursery, find the weeds that are present, make sure that you know the relative abundance of these weed species so that you can look at your management actions and make sure that they will cover the weeds that are present. That will then allow you to respond to the changing abundance of weeds most appropriately. Then, as you have your ongoing management actions, you can assess your weed populations as part of your normal crop health monitoring and make sure that your management actions are up to scratch. Hopefully that makes sense. Questions from anyone, please write them in. John, do we have any already? John?
Can you hear me?
I think we have a move. We can hear you now.
Right, sorry. I must have pressed the wrong button, my mistake. We do have a couple people with their hands raised. I'm just wondering if you do have a question, whether you could just quickly type it in now. I don't have any other questions specifically.
Okay.
Well,
all right.
We did have one person who couldn't hear us, but I'm not sure whether they've actually been able to resolve that problem. That was where is it?
Okay. Yep. Look, let's see. I'm going to unraise all the hands. Okay, great. I can hear you now. That's wonderful. All right, well, if we don't have questions, we're going to keep on moving. Write them in because we have a fairly full webinar.
Yep. And I'll just collate them. I use New South Wales.
Excellent.
Why is that? That's good. Yep.
Beautiful. All right, so on to our cultural management practices. These cultural management practices are these passive actions that prevent weeds from establishing. They are not rocket science. They're all really basic, but just because they're basic doesn't mean that they aren't simple, that they aren't complex to install. They can be quite simple concepts, but may be difficult to make actually happen to implement at your nursery. In addition, most of these practices will assist you in managing crop health at your nursery generally. So by implementing them, you will reduce weeds as well as improve your crop health, uniformity, and so on and so forth. The most important overarching strategies are that we do not allow weeds to go to seed. If we stop weeds from going to seed, you will go a huge way to managing your weeds at the nursery. The other main strategy is to break the life cycle of the weed in the nursery, and of course the two are interlinked. If you stop them from going to seed, then you're going to have some residual seeds potentially floating around. You're always going to have some drop in via wind and birds and so on and so forth. So those have to be managed. But if you break the life cycle in each instance, you don't have a exponentially growing problem. Okay, so these hygiene practices, what do they look like? Firstly, inspect your incoming stock and remove weeds from those plants. Sometimes you've got to remove the top layer of media, particularly if you've received stock with algae or liverwoods. Who does that sort of thing? Just raise your hand if you are you're inspecting and removing weeds. Yes, we have some. Now, who goes further? Who then contacts their supplier and says, mate, we got your consignment and they are just full of weed X, Y, and Z. What's going on? Who does that? Yes, I got another hand. Great, a couple people. Wonderful to hear that. Get that going. Now go one step further. Who then says, well, how have you been managing those weeds? Have you put on some herbicide, let's say a selective pre-emergent herbicide, or is this just a hand weed upon dispatch? Okay, that is something that you can do, and it's particularly important for certain types of weeds where a hand weed can spread the problem. I'm thinking liverworts and algae. Liverwort in particular, a hand weed only will likely spread that weed throughout the dispatch as opposed to just removing them. So it will then become important for you to follow up with appropriate actions. Okay, store your media appropriately on sealed surfaces. Have it covered. I love this structure here. This was at a WA nursery. They've got a system where they can raise the roof so that the truck can pour the media in and then lower it down to stop organic matter, stop the vast majority of rain from moving into the media. A moist environment that has seed falling into it, of course, is much worse you're going to compound your problem right from the get-go. So reduce exposure to weed seed and water. Likewise, store your containers under cover, wherever possible, somehow sealed in such a way to stop organic matter, stop seed from getting into the trays, into the containers before you even put your container plant in there. Sorry, did I skip? No, I didn't. All right, don't recycle your growing media. Pretty basic, you're more likely to have all sorts of problems. Manage your discarded plants appropriately. If you've got a chuck out pile full of potentially dead plants, or maybe plants that have died from various diseases, you probably also have weeds present. This is increasing the inoculum load of weed seed, effectively, the load of weed seeds at your nursery. We want to reduce those sorts of inputs to our nursery. And think about, if you think, okay, well, I'm disinfesting my trays and my containers. Well, how are you disinfesting them? If you're using chlorine, probably not going to do much against the weed seeds. If you're using heat, well, consider 60 degrees, 30 minutes. That's the normal practice for disinfesting seed, disinfesting bacterial infections, disinfesting fungal infections from seed plants. So that's great. The weed's going, you beauty, now I don't have any bacteria or fungi. So it's really important, if you are reusing your trays and containers, you get rid of all the organic matter, because that's the only way for weed seed. Ensure equipment, tools, machinery are free of weeds. Windbreaks are an option. I'm curious, has anyone installed a windbreak and noticed a dramatic decrease in the weed load over time? Yes, at least one. Wonderful. Sometimes that can be great, and you'll have to modify the height of your windbreak depending on the exact situation. Hopefully you don't have neighbors that produce loads of seeds. Unfortunately, sometimes this is it's a very real problem that some nurseries have when sharing isn't always caring. Okay, so keep your growing areas clean between crop cycles. This is critical, and most nurseries do it, but that will then provide a clean start for each cycle. All right. Grow on raised beds. This can, of course, provide a physical barrier between the ground where there might be seeds and the plants. Not always, of course, with those explosively releasing seeds. Weed mat and coarse gravel, that also helps in terms of your moisture on the surface and reducing weeds. If you have in-ground mother stock plants, having it look pristine like this is wonderful. You're reducing your weed load in the area to a large extent. But there are also mulches available for actual container plants that can reduce weeds substantially. In certain instances, it can be still cost-effective for things like liverwort, when you have a massive problem and you've just got to throw everything at it to break that life cycle. So keep the top of the media dry. So don't overwater. Increase your air-filled porosity as much as possible to be able to also grow the plants optimally. And if you can, change that media composition so that you keep the top of the media dry. This reduces the ability for weeds to germinate and whatnot. Fertilize optimally. Don't over-fertilize. Reduce a nutrient availability at the surface. Out of interest, who top dresses with slow-release fertilizer? I'll just lower hands. Yeah, we got at least one. Okay, so if you are top dressing and you are also having a continuous weed problem, you may be making your problem more difficult than it needs to be. By having those nutrients, high nutrient load on the surface of the container, you are providing a ready food source for the weeds at that surface, compared to incorporating your slow release fertilizer or dibbling lower into the pot. It's better to do those incorporation and the dibbling to lower the amount of nutrients on the surface. This will decrease the rate at which the weeds grow and reduce the amount of germination that you're going to get, establishment in your crop. So by changing your fertilizer practices, people have found sometimes up to even an 80% reduction in weeds. So it can be a really important area. Don't retain old stock. If you are seeing situations like this, well, for one thing, there's something that's gone wrong here where you're having dead plants, and that happens from time to time, but get rid of those plants. Be like this, where you have a space. Those plants haven't established. Well, why have the media open there? Because sometimes you've got your crop plants and they provide coverage, which will also help you reduce weeds in that pot. So don't retain old stock and remove unsaleable stock. Okay. Do we have any questions at this point, John?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, you can. These buttons. There's just a couple, Andrew. You're talking about the organic mulches. What types can growers use on their pots?
Okay, so there are a whole variety of different mulches that have been researched in relation to particularly liverwort management, and these are summarized in the liverwort management plan, and I'll provide that link in an email post webinar, either later on today or tomorrow. Things like rice hulls, basically it's things that don't provide nutrients to weeds and help you keep the top of the media dry. And, you know, I looked at that specifically before the webinar, and all that information just went boop out of my mind. But there are various different, I mean, even for advanced stocks, there are those mats, like the coir mats. Who uses those coir? Does anyone use a mulch? And if they can share that, that would be great. If you're willing.
And there was another question with regards trying to break the life cycles. How long do weed seeds generally survive for in the soil or in potting mixes?
Oof. That's going to depend on the biology of the weed, but typically it's years more than it's years. I mean, some weed seeds last for 20 plus years. Really, from the perspective of the life of a nursery crop, it's going to live for longer than the period of time than it will be in the pot. So reducing the number of weed seeds is critical.
And I do remember from my college days that they were always saying that 1 year's seeding is 7 years weeding. So
yes, it's a nice little limerick or whatever.
And we just have a comment from Roger. He recently saw olive pit grounds being doing a great job as a weed suppression.
Okay, great. So I'd imagine in that sense, because that's, I mean, olive pits, that's left field for me, but wonderful. Anything where you go, oh, that's a bit strange. Does that actually work? Okay, it works for them perhaps. Yeah. Test it at your nursery. Make sure that it works for you.
Yeah. And there's one of the last questions from Sam. In a situation where median nutrition availability is low, rather than applying nutrients to the pot surface, would foliar feeding be more beneficial?
That's a good question. My gut feeling is that it depends on what you're trying to achieve. A foliar feed is a good hit. You want to make sure then that it's not going to be getting too much on the surface of the media for long periods of time. So it's that slow release action, which we were more talking about, as opposed to a foliar, which is relatively low residual. Though if you are constantly fertigating, you may need to look at your fertigating practices as to whether or not you are promoting weeds more than you need to be.
Okay, that's it for the moment.
Wonderful. All right, we'll keep on going. All right, so the last section, we were combining hand weeding, which is a small section, with herbicides, which is a relatively large section. Okay, so hand weeding, probably there aren't many nurseries that can get away with not hand weeding. And there are some advantages to hand weeding, including removing the plant immediately, removing the seeds that might be on the plant, and hopefully not spreading it if you're careful. And it doesn't cause phytotoxicity. Most of the time, it doesn't damage the plant unless there are a lot of weeds and a sensitive plant, perhaps. But most of the time, it's a non-chemical, quick in terms of a small number of pots to get rid of weeds. But it can be time-consuming when it's done on a large scale, and it can remove some media and cause spills, which is inconvenient because we don't want organic matter in our mulch layer, in our, let's say, gravel layer. And it doesn't have a long-lasting effect. It has to be done regularly. Otherwise, your hand weeding efforts have gone to waste. And it can also break the barrier of pre-emergence herbicides. And we'll talk about that more in the next section. So when we're hand weeding, what we want to make sure that we're doing is stop the weeds from going to seed. If you're hand weeding after the weeds have produced seeds, set seeds, then you're going to be multiplying your problems. And so when you consider that some weeds, they germinate in a week and they might set seed in 3 to 4 weeks and become even more prolific, particularly in warm conditions where the time to set seed may be less, the time to get to seeding may be less. You want to consider your weeding frequency with the time taken to get to the next generation of new plants. With that in mind, John. John? There we are. So how often do you hand weed? And in this poll, can you please tick 2 boxes? One for the top 3. So do you hand weed every 1 to 2 weeks, every 3 to 4 weeks, or more than 5 weeks? And then we also want to know, tick one of these boxes down here. When you're weeding, are you weeding regularly, even when all weeds are small? Or are you weeding after there are large weeds present, after you go, oh, I've got a problem, I better get onto this? So if you can hit the box twice, that would be wonderful. Okay, so we have about 40% have voted. Just to give you hopefully a few more seconds, get those votes in. Just an indication, if you're not sure if it's every 1 to 2 weeks, every 3 to 4 weeks, well, just your gut feeling, that's all right. About half have voted. We'll just close it in 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Can you close that one off, John? And let's have a look at those results. Okay, so about half every 1 to 2 weeks. That's great. And then the other half, roughly more than that. Okay, and then half are weeding when weeds are small, because that's the fortnightly intervals. That makes sense. And then the others are weeding only after large weeds are observed. Okay, we're going to work with that. That's great. Thank you, John. Next slide. We're going to talk about some research that was done in North Carolina looking at frequency of hand weeding. What they did was they compared fortnightly hand weeding events versus weeding every 8 weeks. So the idea is weed before they go to seed, or wait until the plants have gotten big and just deal with them all at once. So the group that pulled the weeds that would set seed in the next 2 weeks, they were pulling the relatively large weeds that were easy to pull, relatively quick to remove. So they pulled these ones here on the right. They looked at that weed and they went, right, that one's going to set seed in the next 2 weeks between now and the next weeding event, so I'm going to take that one. And they would leave the weeds that were relatively small that aren't going to set seeds in the next 2 weeks. And by doing that, they didn't have to pull the weeds that were small, more difficult to pull, more time-consuming to pull. And that was compared to the people that only weeded every 8 weeks when there were loads of weeds around the place. Okay, so now please raise your hand if that explanation made sense to you. Okay, a few raising their hand, that's great. Wonderful. Most have raised their hands. I'm going to lower hands and we'll go on to what they said as their results. The outcome was that the weed growth was reduced by 70% by weeding every 2 weeks and only pulling the weeds that would set seed, versus the people that just waited every 8 weeks. They had 70% more growth. There was that much more biomass. The labor was always reduced, and it was reduced by 10% to 60%. What I find important with this research is that they never showed that by weeding more often did they increase their labor costs. It always reduced the labor costs. 10% tended to be in those times where the weed pressure was lower. And even when the weed pressure was lower and they were regularly weeding, they had a savings in labor. So this is important sort of research, and can be put into practice fairly easily with some mindset changes, perhaps at some nurseries. Out of interest, who has seen this sort of information presented previously? Just raise your hand if you have. A couple? Yep, 3. Okay, great. So a few more, that's great. Still, that means that there are a fair number of people that have not seen this sort of thing, and hopefully it's beneficial. Okay, we're going to move on. So after we have our weed, regardless of the frequency of weeds present, we've got to manage those weeds because there are potentially seeds on it. If you just put them on the ground, they're going to grow again. So dispose of those weeds hygienically in covered bins. So this, assuming that weeds were present in here, if they are explosive seed producers, they could get out. If there's a lot of wind and it's a small seed, it potentially can get out. And when you're mowing, consider that your lawn is potentially a weed, a producer of weeds. Who's seen lawn species in their production area? Just raise your hands if you have. Yeah, I've got a few hands being raised there. That's great. Thank you. So make sure that you're mowing at a frequency to stop the species that are present in your lawn from going to seed and blowing into your production area. And as we said before, avoid hand weeding liverwoods as well as other species that might spread during weeding. And if you have to hand weed those species, make sure you do it in an integrated way with an appropriate Preemergence herbicide to stop the weeds from germinating. Sorry, it's having trouble moving. There we go. All right, so now I'm going to go on to herbicides. Herbicides are great. They can be wonderful tools. However, I want to suggest to you that you do not rely solely on herbicides to manage your weeds. If you do that, you're likely to have a problem at some point. Put as many cultural practices in place to stop the weed load in your nursery, and then your herbicides will have a better chance of working appropriately. It's the same as with pests and diseases. Pesticides generally work best when the population that you're trying to control is relatively low. As soon as you have an abundant pest, whether it's a weed, insect, fungus, whatever, it becomes very difficult. Okay, so now specifically with herbicides, we have some definitions that can be helpful to understand. So you've got selective herbicides and you've got non-selective herbicides. As the name suggests, your selective herbicides tend to affect certain types of plants, certain groups of plants, and have limited effect to other types of weeds. Whereas your non-selectives tend to cause damage or kill many plants. But there are no herbicides that kill absolutely everything, unfortunately. Okay, we have pre-emergence herbicides we've talked about previously, and post-emergence herbicides. So some general traits of pre-emergence herbicides include these. These are herbicides that must be applied prior to weed emergence. They are active against the growing meristems. So the seed, it's on the surface, it produces that radical, it moves out, it touches that barrier, and it goes, oop, no, I can't, I'm dead, and nothing more happens. You don't get a weed growing. So it has to be applied to the surface of weed-free containers. You can imagine if you've already got a weed present, one, your barrier for your pre-emergence herbicide isn't going to be as effective because it's not going to get underneath that weed as well, particularly if it's a high coverage prostrate weed. And not only that, they can produce more seed. They're going to keep on growing because the growing meristems are above and below barrier. They are activated, these herbicides are activated by overhead irrigation. So you have to water them in, it forms that barrier, and actions that disturb the barrier will reduce the efficacy. So excessive movement, if you're hand carting them around and it has lots of movement of the growing media, or it causes the media to settle a great deal, or you apply before the media has settled, you could break your barrier. Poking holes in the surface, whether it be by stakes or other things, and you're poking multiple holes, that produces a break in the barrier. And hand weeding, as we said before, it can break that barrier and allow weeds in the seeds in those holes to go to seed and germinate. Okay, so excessive irrigation, however, is also bad. It can cause leaching of the product down into the pot, into the container where the roots of your actual stock are present, and you might get some phytotoxicity or even just a lack of vigor. You need to make sure you don't leave the product on the foliage of the crop. That can cause damage. Some plants, even though it's a pre-emergence and you're applying it to a plant that is obviously not a seed, you can still get some damage. You need to test these things. Some products cannot be used in enclosed structures, and these are clearly written on the label, so pay attention to that. And most of the time they're effective against either broadleaf or grassy weeds. And you can see here where there's a plot. I mean, I know it's not a nursery, but it's the same sort of idea, where the treated areas have no or very few or no weeds, and the untreated area, loads of weeds. Okay, so then post-emergence weeds are, as the name implies, applied to growing weeds. They've already germinated, they're established, and they are best applied to small weeds that are actively growing. You can see here in this picture, this is a plant that is suspected to have been damaged by a herbicide, where compared to the healthy one. It was suspected to be in water, and this happens from time to time. Every year we have a few nurseries that contact us with some problems where a herbicide has gotten into their irrigation, their dam system, and it's a very problematic, and we'll talk about how to manage that soon. However, back to post-emergence herbicides, the products must remain on the leaves for several hours. And just jumping down a couple dot points, they require a rain and irrigation-free post-application period. So this is completely different from your pre-emergence herbicides. Pre-emergence, you have to water them in, and you don't want them on the leaves. Whereas your post-emergence herbicides, well, you want them on the leaves of your target weeds, and you have to have no irrigation, no water. Some products can be specific to certain grasses and may be able to be applied to nursery crop lines. However, these are not common, and you want to pay attention to your labels to make sure that you're not going to have a phytotoxicity. These products are wonderful in growing areas between crop cycles, so that you can break the life cycle of weeds in that growing area. Now, you still have to treat them with some care so you don't get phytotoxicity in that growing area. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. So for your post-emergence herbicides, there are contact products and systemic products. So contact products are those that are toxic to the area where the product has been applied. And they tend to be fast-acting, and regrowth from the roots is potentially possible. So you can see this diagram here where you've got your contact applied to this plant, and perhaps there's a connection to the next plant where there's runners. This one's not affected. Whereas a systemic product, perhaps you are going to get death of the next plant. So the systemic products move through the plant. Toxicity occurs in days to weeks, and the entire weed becomes exposed because it has moved through the entire plant. They are most effective during active growth. So if you have a stressed plant, it's not growing very much, or it's dormant, and you apply your herbicide, you might get an effect, but it may not be as good as when you have an actively growing plant. Now, I'm just detecting a little bit of background noise in my headset. I don't know why it happens, but I'm just going to fix it. So just bear with me for one minute, 1 second. Okay. Can you just raise your hand, make sure you can hear me? If you can hear me, just raise your hand. Yes, beautiful. All right, I'm going to lower your hands. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the next slide. So, some factors to consider before you're using products. Make sure that you consider your crop species that are present. Are you going to incur a phytotoxicity? The crop growth stage, young plants are more susceptible to all herbicides, in pre-emergence and post-emergence. Make sure that the herbicide is effective against the weed species that are present at your nursery. The weed growth stage is important. Large plants, you're less likely to kill with a herbicide than very small plants. The formulation and the mode of action, you'll see some active ingredients have a huge number of formulations, and this can affect the residuality in the soil and potentially in the water. So keep in mind these things when you're purchasing. Just because it's glyphosate doesn't mean it's exactly the same type of product as a different formulation. Your cropping areas are important. As we said before, some products you cannot use in protected cropping structures. The cost of the product, of course, you keep that in mind, and the other environmental considerations may be very important to everyone, but some businesses have that as a higher priority than others. So, consider all these factors. I'm just going back a slide. When you're purchasing your herbicide and before you're applying the products, as to the purpose. Make sure that the herbicide suits your purpose. Now, maybe you have that situation where herbicides have managed to contaminate a growing area, or your irrigation, your dams. Those are difficult situations, and it's good to understand how herbicides become degraded to try and manipulate these factors to increase the rate at which it's degraded, or to otherwise mitigate risk of phytotoxicity. Okay, and as we said, the formulation is important. The soil type is important. Like a lot of pesticides in heavy soils, in clay soils, you have a much greater residual of herbicides than in a very light, free-draining soil. The temperature, so your environmental conditions, including your light exposure, the amount of UV is an important way in which herbicides break down. The concentration, so how much is present, that's important. And then there are different ways that herbicides break down, and this can be through a chemical hydrolysis or a microbial hydrolysis, so a breakdown with the fungi and the bacteria may be present in the soil and or the water. Also, herbicides and pesticides generally can be bound by organic matter and by things like activated charcoal. Clay and other organic matter can bind that product such that it's not available to be contacted or taken up by plants. But keep in mind that sometimes it is possible for that product to be released from the whatever it's bound to. All right. So these ones are the ones that are most important for degradation of herbicides. And so what you can do is a few things. If you have if you need to decontaminate a growing area, well, one, you can remove and dispose of that soil or growing media. And it can be either off-site, which can be expensive, but sometimes it's still necessary, or on-site. And you want to make sure that you have a method to keep leachate, so the product, from moving into the environment and particularly into your growing areas. You can bind products with things like activated charcoal. That's the one that I have seen be used or heard that be used most regularly. I'd be interested to know if anybody else has other products that they have used to deactivate effectively a herbicide in a growing area. Other areas can be just a physical barrier. So you limit the contact of the contaminated soil or media or potentially water with your crop plants. So raise them on benches, use town water until such time as you can grow plants effectively. It is also possible to grow plants that are not susceptible. So if you know what herbicides you've put on your property, you've tested your water, you go, there you go, it is present there at a rate which could be affecting our plants. You may well be able to investigate and change the subsets of plants. And again, some varieties, let's say of tomatoes or certain crop plants, can be more susceptible than others. All right. So just to give an idea, and I realize we're running out of time, but we are close to the end. Different products have different persistence in water and in soil. And this table is an excerpt from this fact sheet here. Gives an idea of the types of products, some of which are used in production nurseries. How long does it last in the soil? Okay, 20 days, 6 months, X number of days. Different conditions will increase or decrease that rate. What's important to know is that some products are somewhat worrying Okay, and when you're purchasing your products, it's worthwhile looking into how, if something went wrong, if I mismanaged this product, how long would it stay in my irrigation? Things like this one, I wouldn't want that in my dam. Goodness. Okay. And just back on that, there is also a lot of technical information that is available with the producers of these herbicides and other groups. And there's another one of these sites has a great deal of information. All right, so take care when you're using herbicides, particularly where you are recycling water. And I think we've actually covered most of this, and in the interest of time, we'll keep on going. So evaluate your herbicides. It's not enough just to go, okay, I put on the herbicide, it's doing great. Make sure that you follow up. Is it actually being effective? Run trials initially before you use it widespread. Is it going to be effective? Is it going to cause any damage to my plant? Is it just going to even reduce the rate at which roots are formed? And this sort of thing doesn't have to be large. It can be quite simple, where you have a treated area and compare it to a non-treated area. Make sure it's effective at the weeds that are present in your production area, and they are not causing a phytotoxicity to the range of plants that you want to apply it to. Okay, now on to herbicide resistance. Herbicide resistance, there are some species of plants that become resistant to a herbicide when before they were resistant, they were susceptible, they were killed readily. And then there are some weeds that are just naturally tolerant to a particular herbicide, as we've mentioned previously. What's important is that you don't assume that resistance has occurred just because a weed isn't killed. More often, you've actually had a problem occur in your growing area, and these sorts of things can cause product failure. So inefficient application. The rate may be wrong. Maybe you haven't covered it. Maybe it hasn't been incorporated or moved into to form that barrier correctly. Maybe there's been unfavorable conditions. Maybe someone accidentally turned on the irrigation when they shouldn't have, and then that didn't get reported back to you. Maybe they were applied when the plants were too large for control, or maybe the product has broken down and you need to apply it again. It's a low persistence product. It's stopped working, and the weeds have occurred after that. These are the clues that you need to use to see if herbicide resistance has actually occurred. So if you see this combination of traits in your production area, you can go, maybe I've got herbicide resistance. Okay, so you've put on a product, it normally controls these 10 weeds, and normally it's controlled all of those 10 weeds. But in this case, I put on the application and one weed wasn't controlled. That weed, of course, had been previously susceptible, and there were some healthy plants scattered among dead plants. So if you were finding that situation where there were, obviously it's been effective against killing some of that weed, but some plants were coming through and scattered amongst the area were healthy. You might go, or perhaps things like this where they're sort of eking by but are able to still produce seed. Maybe you'd go, okay, this is something that's worth keeping an eye on for resistance, and you'd want to look at some of these. Well, you want to put in place herbicide resistance management strategies anyway, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So, implement your cultural practices. John and I are constantly talking about this. Whenever we have a webinar or workshop or anything, these cultural practices are critical. Follow your label, rotate. Don't use, and when we say rotate, what we mean is do not apply herbicides of the same mode of action group unless it says to do so specifically on the label. you can apply a combination of 2 or more herbicides from different mode of action groups on the same day. And there are some herbicides that are a combination product off the shelf. However, you want to watch out for pesticide incompatibility. So if you're not confident that you can do that, then perhaps apply them sequentially. And there's information on pesticide incompatibility and how to assess that online if you need that information. Use products that are effective against the weeds that you've got at the correct rate. Use non-selective products between crops in non-growing areas and in non-growing areas. So that just helps to break the life cycle and stop those weeds from getting back in and having a continuous population at your nursery. So if you're always killing all the plants that would potentially go to seed, you don't have a resident population of seed that is continually exposed to the same herbicides. It's the wind bringing it in, it's the birds bringing it in, it's so on and so forth. Those seed are less likely to be resistant than the ones that are continuously being exposed to the product. Okay, so now they were on the last couple of slides. These are some of the post-emergence products as of this month that can be used in production nursery, or they'll have a label for use in nursery production areas. This information is available in the weed management plan that we put together and is available online on the Nursery FMS website. I'll have a link to that sent out to everyone post-webinar. In the interest of time, I will have this webinar online on the NGIA YouTube channel, and you can look at it again. I'm going to keep on moving on. However, the one thing that I want to add to this is that there may be additional products that you can use against specific weeds and in non-cropping growing areas that don't specifically say for use in nursery areas. Okay, pre-emergence herbicides. These are, again, products that are available. The vast majority of these are in the weed management plan that is online, except for I'll just go back. These two, my understanding is Indaziflam is a very new product, and we may have just missed, however you say that one. It was our intent to get everything. Hopefully we haven't missed any. If you know of some that are available, please let us know so that we can update our material. Okay, the last point, I had a query before the webinar about availability of herbicides changing over time, and particularly some of the ones that are widely used in the production nursery industry. What I'm going to say to that is I don't necessarily have a silver bullet for that. Herbicide availability is going to change over time. That's something we can rely on, and that happens for a range of different factors. We also know that herbicide availability, we're going to have new herbicides available to us over time. So the recommendation is grow with that expectation that herbicides are going to change, and grow with the notion that herbicides aren't going to solve all my problems. Use cultural practices to limit the weeds, and then the herbicides are just the icing on the cake sort of thing. So hopefully that makes sense. And that is in fact the rest, that is the webinar. I apologize that we've gone over time a smidgen. Last thing, many of the pictures that we put in the webinar, it said Joe Neal. He thankfully gave us permission to use those photos in the weed management plan and in our material. So thanks to him. If you want more information, you can email us at GrowHelp, and we will send a survey, which is really great if you could complete that survey. It will be short, maybe 5 to 8 minutes, and we'll have this webinar available online soon. John, do we have any final questions or comments?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear
Andrew?
you.
Okay.
Yes.
No, there's just one comment from Robert. He's mentioned with regards fertilizers that with regards water-soluble liquid or foliar fertilizers, they're more likely to add more nutrients to the surface of the media than dibbling controlled release fertilizers. So that might have an impact on weed populations as well. So it's just something to consider.
Okay. Great. All right. Thank you.
But no more questions. That's it for this webinar.
All right. In which case, thank you for joining us.
Yep. Thank you, everyone.